Hi, I'm Dr. Gwyn Erwin, and welcome back to my channel, Healing for Your Life. I'm so glad to be with you today, and we're going to start with the Keystone 2 of the developmental model of wounded development. So this is model 2 of my 4 original models, and this one is, I'm combining wounded and traumatized development, even though I have them as 2 separate models, but I'm combining them in this series. And this is Keystone 2, which is on implicit memory and implicit memory intrusions. So I'm going to begin with a somewhat of a combination of a review and a look into the different aspects that make up implicit memory. Now, you've maybe listened to the implicit memory video in Model 1 on healthy development. And now we're going to look at what happens with implicit memory and the roles that it plays in wounded and traumatized development. On my resources page on my website at www.gwynerwin.com, there are free downloads, and one of them says memory comparison chart. So I would like you to download that and print it out for yourself, because it's a lot of material and it will help you do a couple of things. First of all, it's arranged in 2 columns. 2 vertical columns. On the left side of the page are all of the elements about implicit memory, or what we call procedural memory. And on the right-hand column, as you face the page, you'll see explicit memory, or what's called declarative memory. So you'll see the elements of each one of those kinds of memory systems, but they're arranged so that each element you can compare side by side. So you see how an element operates in implicit memory and how it operates in explicit memory. And I just want you to become familiar with it, because even though every keystone in my model of development is vital and essential and indispensable to the other ones, states and implicit memory are so especially impactful in terms of our experience. And so it's something I want you to be very aware of, especially if you are suffering or struggling or trying to figure out what's going on with your own psychological system and how you get triggered and how you respond to things that come up. So I'm going to go through these elements of implicit memory right now and do some exploration with you. The first thing to know is that implicit memory is present in the last stages in utero and at birth, and then it continues to function throughout our entire lives. Explicit memory, which is what we think of as recall memory, doesn't really start until about the 3rd year of life. So implicit memory is operating at birth and throughout our experience. Implicit memory is the encoding, that not only the taking in, but the absorption and the retrieval of our lived experience. That's sort of the number one thing to remember about it. We are not trying to learn something. We're not having to practice it. It's something that occurs as we live. Our external experience becomes internalized, and that is implicit memory. We don't have to be conscious of it happening either, whereas in explicit memory, when you're learning something like multiplication tables, you're having to do it purposefully and consciously and with practice. Implicit memory just gets absorbed. Something very particular about it is that it gets absorbed and plays out when it's retrieved or triggered in the procedural steps in which the originating experiences occurred. I'm going to talk about this for a minute. When we are taking in our experience, there is a sequence of an event. It needs intensity, duration, and repetition for it to form a neuronal pathway. And that's true for implicit memory as well. So if you are in an intense experience, positive or negative, it isn't just negative, positive or negative, it's intense, it has some duration, and it's going to repeat. That is going to form a new neuronal pathway in our brain, and it is going to become part of our implicit memory system. And that segment of time, that event that is going, or that experience, I should say, because it could be a relational experience too, not so much an event, is going to be encoded in the procedural steps of it, which means it begins somewhere, and then it goes somewhere else, and then the next thing happens, and the next thing happens, and the next thing happens, and then that experience ends for the time being. So 30 years later, if there is a trigger that just fits perfectly like a lock and a key to that originating experience, it only needs a whiff of the originating experience to retrieve that implicit memory. But it's going to retrieve it with the original intensity and duration. That's very important to understand in post-traumatic stress and complex post-traumatic stress, and we're going to come back to that in just a few minutes. When implicit memory is triggered by some stimulus and it is retrieved, it is the past coming forward into current time. Now, a lot of people have heard the phrase flashbacks, and somebody hears a car backfiring and they're suddenly in Afghanistan in the war again. Hearing gunshot wounds, and their current experience fades away, and they are feeling and reacting to everything as though they were still in the war. That is a post-traumatic stress episode. So I call them flash forwards because we're not really going back. Our past is coming forward and now living in current time. And you'll often think yourself or hear people say, I don't know what happened. There was really nothing major. It was just a little something. And suddenly I was absolutely overcome, and I might as well have been a 3-year-old hiding under the table, and I relived this horrific experience. I'm still shaking from it. That's an implicit memory reliving. I want you to have this language available to you. Another important thing to realize is that implicit memory is completely state dependent. If you remember from our last video and from the first video on states in the first series, everything has to do with states. We are always in some kind of state. And so implicit memory is what we call use and state dependent. We're in a state, things are getting used, and implicit memory forms out of that experience. These implicit memories also form perceptual bias, which we talked about last time, which is one of the 8 elements in states. And perceptual bias comes out of our belief systems that come out of our repetitive experience. So we have a positive belief about ourselves, like I was really valued by my parents, and They just gave me so much confidence that when I meet a new challenge, I kind of have a lot of energy and feel excited by it. And I really think even if I don't succeed at first, I'm going to be able to overcome the obstacles and eventually succeed. That is repetitive, implicit memory, positive experience. It is state dependent on states of optimism and confidence and cheerfulness and feeling good in one's body and in one's mind, and there are belief systems that I really can do whatever I set my mind to do. And then we have the perceptual bias with new experience that I'll be able to do that. That's a great implicit memory system. On the other hand, we may have a very negative set of implicit memory experiences of, gee, when I had to face an obstacle or a big challenge when I was growing up, over and over again, there was really nobody there to guide me. They didn't teach me, they didn't really help me. Sometimes they made fun of me because I was trying something new and they didn't think I'd be able to succeed at it. And so I get kind of quivery and shy and timid and don't really feel like I'm going to be able to do much of anything about it. And when obstacles come, I know I'm not going to be able to, face the challenge and overcome the obstacles. So in this scenario, and then of course the person does fail, and then they have just now verified both a state system and an implicit memory, what I call bank. And now when they have other new experience, that implicit memory is going to get triggered, retrieved, and relived again, unless we find interventions for that individual, which there are. Speaking of which, I have done a lot of very original work in this field. And part of my dissertation and my new books that are coming out have my work in them. I've created a number of therapeutic techniques for decoding and working with implicit memory banks that are so difficult for people. And I will be sharing those in 2 courses, one for the mainstream audience and one for the clinical audience, in 2 courses that'll be available on my website probably by year's end. So there are 2 other things that I want you to realize about implicit memory is that it is not ordinarily able to be used for learning. It is just used for repeating and reliving. It's cocooned in the right hemisphere. It involves usually the negative ones, trauma states. And so when they're retrieved, they are used only for reliving. It's only as we decode them, process them, map them, and use various interventions that I have designed that we can actually link them with our left hemisphere and make them usable for learning. So there is hope here. We're not doomed to just repeat these for the rest of our lives. There's a lot we can do about them. That's the good news. And then finally, the part of our brain that gets activated with implicit memory, and we talked about this in the first series on brain development. Here's our head. Here's the back of our head and our neck. Here are our eyes and our mouth and our nose. Right in the middle of our brain is the limbic system. And it's made up of several parts. The 2 I'm going to talk about right now are the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala, if you remember, is the part of our brain that searches for threat. It scans for it. That's its job. It's the seat of emotions, but mainly fear. And so it scans for threat from the inside, a stomach ache, a headache, a temperature, heart beating too fast, some signal inside, and it scans for threats from the outside. and then it mobilizes the body and the mind to try to meet those threats. So during traumatic experience and during traumatic encoding and retrieval, the amygdala, which is our fear sensing part of our limbic system, is activated. But our hippocampus is suppressed. And the hippocampus is our braking system. It's the part of us that says, you can calm down, the threat is over, it's solved. And so sadly enough, all kinds of PET scan research has been done, a lot of it by Bessel van der Kolk at Harvard, that has shown in PET scans that the hippocampus of people who have suffered a lot of trauma is actually physically smaller than it is in people who have not suffered that kind of trauma. And we find that the amygdala, in a sense, doesn't ever quite turn off. It's like a low-grade hum. It's vigilance, it's chronic anxiety. It may not even be as strong as chronic anxiety. It just may be a kind of alertness that people are always kind of waiting for whatever they're waiting for. So in traumatic experience, the amygdala is activated, and with it, cortisol and stress hormones and adrenaline, a lot of energy is generated. And so if you're a person just walking around the world who's had a lot of traumatic experiences, and your implicit memory banks are getting triggered on a regular basis, that is an exhausting way to live. You may be very high functioning, and in most cases people are, because they've had to learn to be, and they're quite capable and intelligent, and they're able to bring all kinds of areas of themselves to bear to get through these experiences, but it's like living in a minefield for them. It's a very challenging way to have to live. So those are the elements of implicit memory. Now, when we are dealing with development where there has been a lot of wounding or trauma to ourselves, there's going to be quantitatively and qualitatively less positive implicit memory support internally and more challenged implicit memory intrusions that are disturbing and upsetting and are responding to the threats we've had throughout our lives. And so I want you to appreciate what you may be up against. If your therapist or a friend or a parent or a spouse or somebody says to you, you do have, major depressive disorder, or you do have an anxiety disorder, that doesn't really explain the complexity you are dealing with. What you are dealing with is the retrieval of these implicit memory banks that are state dependent, that affect your behavior, your emotions, your belief systems, your perceptual bias, your physical sensations, your language, your memory, your voice. All of the 8 areas of states are impacted because they were all present when these implicit memory banks were first encoded. And then as those experiences repeat, especially relationally, where it isn't a singular traumatic event, like a car accident or a profound loss, and I'm not diminishing those at all, but the acute trauma is very different than the cumulative trauma that weaves through our relationships on a day-by-day basis. And so the accumulation of traumatic experience results in these implicit memory banks that are both neuronally embedded and charged and are readily retrieved and relived in daily life. And it can make people feel odd to themselves, or different, or alone, or very strange, because this stuff is just going on inside of them all the time. I grew up with a panic disorder. Nobody even knew what it was. There wasn't a name for it as I was growing up. And even when it became identifiable, it didn't have this kind of information available to it. And I'm very fortunate for the really profound therapeutic relationship that I had in my life, that I really do not, and have not for decades, lived in that kind of anxiety where I had panic attacks several times a day. Now, my parents knew I was anxious. They chalked it up to being shy. Most of my traumatic experience occurred under the radar, so they weren't aware of it, but some of it they were, and they did not deal with it. I don't think they knew how. I think it didn't fit into the kind of family presentation we had in the world, which was of a very accomplished family and a respected family. And, it was during times that you just didn't talk about things. But even when I was older and I tried to have certain conversations, they were impossible to come by because my mother or father just were very challenged by having those kinds of intimate conversations. They could have other kinds of very deep conversations, but not of that particular kind. So I was very fortunate to be in a really wonderful marriage where we could talk about anything. And I was very fortunate to have the therapeutic help that I had at the time that I did, because it really changed my life. And so I come to you with these videos, and they're not just theoretical, and they're not just out of my clinical experience, they're out of very personal experience as well. And so my empathy is with you, my compassion is with you, but I also want you to know you can begin to embrace, even if it's the size of a grain of sand, some grit, that there are answers. And there are ways of working with these situations. There are a whole variety of ways. Many, like EMDR or art therapy or psychodynamic therapy or NET, or all kinds of therapies are out there, and good therapists to work with you. So I really encourage you, if you suffer from a lot of implicit memory intrusions, not even on a daily basis, but even if it's weekly or monthly, that's way too much for you to have to incorporate in the stress of your life. And your life will measurably improve as you get help with that. So I want to wrap up this video with that kind of encouragement, but in the meantime, I want you to recognize what is actually happening to you when these intrusions occur. There will be a slight trigger or prompt. You might not even notice it right away. You might discover it in retrospect, but in the moment, it might not feel good. You may not like it. You might be uncomfortable, but you might not really give it the negative credit that it's due. But some whiff happens. Some person looks a certain way, does a certain thing, and in all of the complexity of the day, it fits exactly into your implicit memory bank. And now that implicit memory bank starts, and it plays out in the procedural steps of the originating experience, and you go from here to there to there to there, and there are state shifts in every single one of those procedural steps. So you might start out just feeling uneasy. Pretty soon you might feel anxious, then you get afraid, you might feel horror, you might want to run, you might feel shame, but there is a step-by-step process involved in it. In these experiences, the past is going to feel current time. And the way you're going to know that is your mind is going to say something like, oh my God, it's happening again. I can't stand this one more time. Or it's happening again. There's nothing I can do about it other than I've just got to leave where I am, go take care of myself, and just recover from this. But there will be that feeling of it's happening again. As you learn about your implicit memory bank, any one of them, you're going to be able to say, oh, I know what's happening now. And even that will be a help, because you'll begin to recognize what is actually playing out. And you'll get to the place where you'll know what's coming next. And then later on in my other videos, we'll talk about interventions, and as well as preventions, but interventions and solutions. And then you have to recover from these, and you have to get conscious enough of them and integrate it with all of your wonderful other skill sets and qualities of being that you have, so that you can use these for learning. So I hope this has been as helpful as I intended it to be, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, and bye for now.